man's nappy in a bucket of water, tipped the bucket into the street. 127 people were dead within 3 days, 500 within 10. The streets emptied so fast, the bodies piled up faster than anyone could move them. Children, whole families. A man who'd been fine at breakfast was blue and cold by dinner. Doctors had no idea what was killing them. The city had no idea what was killing them. But here is the part that should make you angry. Someone figured it out. He gave them the proof. He showed them exactly what was happening and exactly why. He handed them the answer on paper. And the most powerful medical institution in England looked at his evidence and said, "We don't believe you." He died 2 years later. They never told him he was right. His name was John Snow, and what they did to him, and what they let happen because they refused to listen, is the story of how an entire city learned to ignore the truth until the truth started killing people by the hundreds. London in the summer of 1854 was a city that had learned to live with its own rot. 200,000 cesspits underneath the streets. Most of them haven't been emptied in years. Sewage and animal waste and slaughterhouse runoff seeping through the soil, into the groundwater, into the wells people drew their drinking water from every single morning. The Thames at low tide smelled like an open mass grave. It basically was one. And nobody thought this was the problem. Because for decades, for generations, the smartest doctors in England had operated on a theory that explained everything. Miasma, bad air, invisible poisonous particles rising from decay and filth, travelling through the atmosphere and entering the body. If the air smelled wrong, people got sick. If you cleaned the smell away, disease followed. And the evidence for it was genuinely compelling. Disease rates were higher in dirty, low-lying, reeking neighbourhoods. That was real data. The correlations held up across city after city. The theory predicted patterns accurately enough that the most respected statisticians in the country built careers defending it. William Farr was the best of them. He worked at the General Register Office, which meant he had access to every death certificate filed in England. He was meticulous. He was brilliant. He'd spent years building a dataset showing cholera mortality fell as altitude rose above sea level. The math was correct. The conclusion was catastrophically wrong. Lower elevations had more cholera not because of the air, but because low-lying neighbourhoods had more access to contaminated river water. Farr didn't know that yet. Nobody did. So he watched the Broad Street outbreak begin, looked at his elevation data, and saw exactly what miasma theory predicted. He wasn't an idiot. He was brilliant. He was just looking at the wrong thing. Here is what was actually happening underneath Broad Street. At number 40, the house closest to the pump, a 5-month-old girl named Frances Lewis had been sick for 4 days. The kind of sick that soaks through everything. Her mother, Sarah, did what any mother would do. She rinsed the soiled nappies in a bucket of water and tipped the bucket out into the street, into the cesspit in front of the house. The cesspit was 3 feet from the well. 3 feet. The brickwork between them was old and cracked and rotting. Fecal matter seeped through the soil from the cesspit into the water supply of the most densely populated neighbourhood in one of the most densely populated cities on earth. Frances Lewis died on the 2nd of September 1854. By then, 127 of her neighbours were already dead. John Snow was not supposed to be the man who solved this. He was an anesthesiologist. He'd spent his career studying how to put people under safely, designing inhalers, tracking dosages in meticulous handwritten diaries, figuring out exactly how much chloroform it took to stop pain without stopping breathing. He was so precise and so trusted that in April 1853 they called him to Buckingham Palace to administer chloroform to Queen Victoria during childbirth. The Queen described it as soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. But Snow had another obsession. He'd been watching cholera kill people since he was a teenager, apprenticed to a surgeon in Newcastle during the 1831 epidemic. And something about the way it killed never sat right with him. Cholera attacked the gut, violent vomiting, diarrhea so extreme, the stuff doctors called rice water stools, pale and milky and almost odorless, that adults could lose a litre of fluid per hour. Patients would cramp and collapse, their eyes sinking into their skulls, their skin going cold and clammy and a greyish blue from dehydration. The Blue Death. A respiratory disease would attack the lungs. Snow kept asking why a disease supposedly spread through the air was destroying the digestive system. Nobody had a good answer. In 1849, he published a pamphlet arguing cholera was carried in contaminated water, that the poison came from the waste of victims, got into the water supply, and killed the next person who drank it. It was a clean, logical, evidence-based argument. The medical establishment ignored it completely. He heard about the Broad Street outbreak on the night it started. He lived nearby on Sackville Street. He walked over. What he found was a neighbourhood coming apart, bodies being carried out of doorways, families who'd sent someone to fetch water from the pump that morning and watched them collapse by afternoon. 3/4 of the residents who could afford to leave had already left. Not because they knew what was killing them, but because they understood that leaving was the only option. Snow went back to his rooms and started working. He got the death register from the General Register Office. He went door to door through the remaining households, asking every person he could find one question. Where do you get your water? The pattern was immediate. Almost every death clustered within 250 yards of the pump at the corner of Broad Street and Cambridge Street. The water tasted good. People genuinely preferred it to the other local sources. They walked past closer pumps to use it. But Snow needed to explain the exceptions, because in science, the exceptions are where the truth lives. The workhouse on Poland Street sat directly in the middle of the worst affected area. 535 people lived there. In a neighbourhood where the death rate was among the highest ever recorded in England, 5 of them died from cholera. 5. Snow went and checked. The workhouse had its own deep well inside the building. It had never used the Broad Street pump. Then there was the Lion Brewery on Broad Street itself. Over 70 workers, 0 deaths. Snow went and found out why. The brewery had its own water supply, and the men, this being a brewery, drank beer during their shifts instead of water. The air theory couldn't explain any of this. The workhouse inmates and the brewery workers breathed exactly the same air as everyone dying around them. Then Snow found the widow. Susannah Eley had moved away from Soho entirely. She'd relocated to Hampstead, far from Broad Street, far from the outbreak zone. She died of cholera anyway. Snow tracked down her family and learned she'd loved the taste of the Broad Street water so much that she had it carted to her home daily. A bottle was fetched the morning of the 31st of August. She was dead within days. The water was the killer. The evidence was clear. Snow had built a case that by any reasonable scientific standard should have been enough to convince anyone paying attention. On the evening of the 7th of September 1854, Snow walked into the meeting room of the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish. He laid out his death tabulations, his interview records, his evidence. The board did not believe him. They believed the air. They had always believed the air. The miasma theory was not just a medical hypothesis to these men, it was the foundation of 2 decades of public health policy. Accepting Snow's water theory meant accepting that everything they'd built was wrong. But they were scared enough of the death toll to act. The next morning, 8 September 1854, the handle was removed from the Broad Street pump. And here is what the story always leaves out. The epidemic was already dying. 3/4 of Soho had fled. The people still falling sick were people already exposed before the handle came down. Snow himself wrote that the mortality had been much diminished by the flight of the population before the board acted at all. The handle's removal did not stop the outbreak. The outbreak was already stopping on its own. When it was over, the board put the handle back. Because they didn't believe Snow's theory. They had treated it as a precaution, nothing more. Snow spent the next year writing the 2nd edition of his cholera book. He drew the famous map, the dots for each death clustered around the pump, and presented it to the London Epidemiological Society in December 1854. He put together the most complete waterborne transmission argument anyone had ever assembled. The General Board of Health reviewed it in 1855. They rejected it. Their official conclusion: the cause of the Broad Street outbreak was atmospheric, not water, air. Quote, "After careful inquiry, we see no reason to adopt this belief." They called their preferred explanation a rivalry of foulness between impure water and impure air, a phrase that reads today like a parody of institutional self-protection. Meanwhile, in the spring of 1855, a local clergyman named Henry Whitehead was doing his own investigation. Whitehead had read Snow's book and thought it was wrong. He was a curate at St. Luke's Church. He knew every face in that neighbourhood, every family, every address. He set out to find the cases Snow had missed, the deaths near the pump that weren't caused by the water. What he found was Francis Lewis. He found the record of the 5-month-old girl at 40 Broad Street, one of the earliest deaths, the house nearest the pump. He went and found Sarah Lewis still living there and interviewed her. Sarah told him about the nappy, the bucket, the cesspit. The man who had set out to destroy John Snow's theory had instead found the evidence that proved it. Whitehead also found that Thomas Lewis, the baby's father, a police constable, had come down with a fatal cholera attack on the 8th of September, the exact day the pump handle was removed. Sarah almost certainly rinsed his soiled clothing into the same cesspit. Whitehead concluded that even though the handle hadn't stopped the first wave, it had probably cut off a second one. The skeptic had become the proof. John Snow suffered a stroke on the 10th of June 1858 while sitting at his desk. He died 6 days later at 45 years old. He had never been vindicated. The establishment had never admitted he was right. The theory he'd spent a decade building had been officially rejected by the most powerful medical body in England. The Lancet, the most prestigious medical journal in the country, published his obituary on the 26th of June 1858. 2 sentences. Dr. John Snow. This well-known physician died at noon on the 16th instant at his house in Sackville Street from an attack of apoplexy. His researches on chloroform and other anaesthetics were appreciated by the profession. That was it. No mention of cholera, no mention of the pump, no mention of the 616 people in Soho who were alive because of what he had worked out. The Lancet issued a formal correction in 2013, 155 years later. They described the original obituary as perhaps, quote, somewhat overly negative in tone. That's the correction. That's all they said. The proof Snow needed came in 1883. Robert Koch isolated the cholera bacterium in pure culture, Vibrio cholerae, first in Egypt, then in Calcutta. The organism that killed 616 people on Broad Street finally had a name and a face under a microscope. What almost nobody knows is that an Italian anatomist named Filippo Pacini had already seen it in 1854. The same year as the Broad Street outbreak, Pacini looked at the intestinal tissue of cholera victims and identified the bacterium. He named it. He published his findings. Nobody paid attention. The organism wasn't formally named Vibrio cholerae Pacini 1854 until 1965, 111 years after he found it. Snow's real proof wasn't the pump handle. It was something called the Grand Experiment, a natural experiment running across South London that he'd been tracking for months. Two water companies served adjacent streets in the same neighbourhoods, mixing their customers house by house. The Southwark and Vauxhall Water Company drew its water directly from the Thames, below the sewage outflows. The Lambeth Water Company had moved its intake upstream in 1852, above where the city's waste went in. Snow went door to door through 40,000 homes. Same streets, same elevation, same air, same poverty. Southwark and Vauxhall customers, 315 deaths per 10,000 households. Lambeth customers, 37 deaths per 10,000 households. 8 times the death rate. That number, 315 against 37, is the cleanest piece of evidence for waterborne cholera transmission that existed in the 19th century. It is also the piece of the story that almost never makes it into the textbooks, because it doesn't have a pump handle to photograph. When you call a doctor to track an outbreak today, when you watch contact tracers map the spread of a new pathogen, going door to door, asking who touched what, who drank what, who was where, you are watching a method John Snow built in 1854 in a neighbourhood that wanted him to be wrong. COVID-19 contact tracing, Ebola outbreak investigation, every epidemiological field study that starts with a case map and a list of questions. All of it traces back to a physician walking through a dying neighbourhood in Soho with a notebook and a death register and a question nobody else was asking. The Broad Street pump today is a replica. It stands on Broadwick Street near the original site. There is a pub next to it named the John Snow. Every year, the John Snow Society holds a ceremony, a lecture, and then a ceremonial removal of a pump handle. It is a small gesture, smaller than it should be. Sarah Lewis went on with her life on Broad Street. There is no record of what she felt when Whitehead told her what the bucket had started. Frances Lewis, 5 months old, died on the 2nd of September 1854. Nobody has ever found her grave. And the institution that could have saved hundreds of people, if it had been willing to believe a single doctor with a notebook and a theory, spent the next 155 years waiting for someone to ask for a correction. They got one. 2 sentences. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this.